Welcome, everyone, to this 28th day of April of 2016. My name is Luke Thomas, and this is the MMA Beat. Thank you so much for joining us. As you can see, we're one man down today. Ariel is off. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he's back next week. Isn't that right?
Yes.
So he'll be back next week. We'll be full strength next week, but ready to rock today. A lot to get to. Really appreciate you guys being here. By the way, as I mentioned before, I'm Luke Thomas of the Luke Thomas Show, SiriusXM, also MMAfighting.com. The man to my left, Jeff Wagenheim of SportsIllustrated.com and the Washington Post as well. And then you man the hat at the end, Chuck Mindenhall. Before we get to the topics of the day, he is the man in the shirt. He's the man in the shirt twice. So he's the man in the shirt reputationally. He's also the man in the brand new MMA Beat t-shirt. There you can see it there. You can get it at MMAwarehouse.com. All proceeds go to Hire Heroes USA. That's the organization that Brian Stan is the CEO of. It helps veterans with professional career reentry and all number of things. As a vet, I can tell you it's an extraordinarily important cause. Our vets need our help, and this shirt gets them at least one step closer. So please go buy one if you can. Even if you can't, just go buy one anyway. Go bankrupt trying to buy one of these shirts.
And it feels really good.
Does it? Yes.
Yeah.
It's like what? It's like polyester and cotton, right?
It's very comfortable.
There you go.
Yeah.
And he knows comfort.
Yeah.
That's what I know.
That's my world.
All right, guys. So a lot to get to today. So let's just get down to a brass tacks. Now, there are three big topics floating in MMA, and I feel like they're all connected. We're going to try to keep them as, not disconnected, but as segmented as possible. So let's start with the most forward news. Yesterday, just blocks from here, as a matter of fact, Dana White and the UFC announce we have a main event. UFC 200, and it's not McGregor versus Diaz. It is now officially Jones versus Cormier for the, I guess not at this point, unified light heavyweight title. Jeff, I will start with you. There's a lot to get to here, but let's start with the simple, basic, most obvious question. Is this the right pick for the main event?
Yeah, I think it's a great pick. I think the UFC has upgraded its main event, and I know that there are people right now screaming and throwing things at their, because that guy Conor McGregor was going to be in the main event, and he's not in it anymore. But look, we saw John Jones and DC fight before. We saw John Jones win a pretty decisive victory, but we also saw, McGregor and Diaz fight before. We saw Nate Diaz not only win a decisive victory, but finish him. So I think we can agree that both of these fights have somebody in them where one guy is clearly going to be considered the better guy than the other one, and we'll see what happens on fight night. But this is a fight that not only is, I think, a better fight, but it's also a fight that actually has stakes. That was the big complaint that I had, and I think a lot of other people had about.
It means something.
It means something. There is that championship belt that's on the line. I know the UFC is going to have tried out 2 championship belts, but it's going to be 1 championship belt that actually means something, the one that DC owns. And I think this is a big win for them.
Yeah, if it's met with any kind of dissension or people being upset, it's only because we've seen this fight before. We've seen it be put together on several occasions, and here we are doing it again. I feel like people get a little bit like, oh man, we've been through this. We've already been thinking about this fight for a long time, but it is the right call. When you have a guy who's basically he still had to win the belt, but he inherited it when John Jones was away essentially, and John Jones is now coming back, and it's his belt. He thinks it's his belt, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. It just makes for a good fight. It makes for a good storyline. The two guys are at the top of their, it's John Jones at the top of the game, and Daniel Cormier is the one guy who's his nemesis just below him. He lost the first one. You get to do it again. When you think about UFC 100, which we thought was this colossal event at the time, and you had Brock Lesnar against Frank Mir, it was a rematch. It was sort of similar. Like, it was a guy, Frank Mir, who won the first one, under kind of a controversial way and all this stuff. It kind of feels like that to me a little bit. And when you take the card as a whole and you look at John Jones and Daniel Cormier headlining that card, I think it looks really good. It's catching some heat because I don't know where people's expectations are. They're getting tripped up in the crater left, I guess, when McGregor was taken off the card. But if you look at the card from top to bottom, it's pretty amazing, man. There are named guys all the way through it, title fights, about everything you'd want. Stylistic matchups, everything.
I feel like we're getting a bunch of competing narratives. On the one hand, you got people saying, I've seen this fight before the main event. Yeah. I don't need to see this again. And then, 5 tweets later, they'll be like, you know what? I bet DC would have beat Jones at 197 anyway. Yeah. Well, is it competitive or is it not competitive? Right. Make up your mind here. But I think the interesting part about it is, for me, that what you just raised. Now, look, I think we can all agree, and we'll get to this in just a minute, that the casual hook that McGregor-Diaz provided, particularly at that 200 event, like the forces converging, That's a lot of magic going on there. Okay, fair enough. But you look at that card, you got DC versus Jones, you got Nunes versus Tate, you got Aldo Edgar 2, the return of Cain Velasquez against Travis Brown. You can go down the line. Johnny Hendricks versus Kelvin Gastelum, Kat Zingano versus Amanda Nunes. You got
Sage Northcutt.
Sage Northcutt's on that card, and actually an appropriate.
No,
Exactly.
Kat Zingano against.
Juliana, no, not Pena.
Pena,
I'm sorry.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
You've got Jim Miller versus Takanori Gomi, Diego Sanchez versus Joe Lozon. Okay, by what measurement, gentlemen, is that a bad card?
Yeah.
That is a banger, is it not?
It's a great card, and I think that some of the people who have been criticizing it, there's two things. One, they're criticizing it because they think that McGregor's presence would sell more. I'll acknowledge that that's true. Of course it will. But, look at any industry. It's not always about just what's going to be the big seller. If that were the case, then the greatest pop music out there would be some of the stuff that's at the top of the charts, but really is not the memorable, most important music that we've grown to love over.
Like the Eagles.
Exactly. Perfect. So just from that, yes, McGregor fights always sell, but it's not like they're suddenly taking McGregor and banishing him to Iceland and saying you can't ever leave there. He'll probably be on 201 or 202. So it's like it's a win-win for the UFC. They're gonna have an amazing card at 200, and then they get to reap the benefits of having Conor McGregor headline a different card. That's a win and another win.
I really believe, when UFC 200 has been talked about for so long, it's going to christen the new arena, for UFC and everything. Ronda Rousey was originally going to be on it. Then all of a sudden we have McGregor. These are the stars, right? And I feel like those are the two hottest names that they could get. You had ideas that maybe GSP would come back. There might be CM Punk thrown in. You know what I'm saying? Like all the names were associated. None of those guys ended up on this card, and I feel like that's where people start to get a little tripped up there. They thought there was going to be something up the UFC's sleeve in the end, but Jones Cormier being the fight has been in the hopper for a long time. It's like one of those types of fights you've been thinking about for 2 years now, since they met the first time, going back to UFC 178 actually. So it goes on and on. But I just think that I think people had this idea that the UFC was going to bring out something that was going to be that weird hook that was going to distinguish it from all other cards, rather than looking at the depth of that card and the stylistic matchups. But I mean, if you just step away from those expectations that were probably unreasonable to begin with, the card is fantastic, man. I mean, it's by far, I think, the biggest card they've ever put on. And so, I mean, it's got to be right in that space. Some people are saying like UFC 198 is better. You got a lot of good cards coming up, but UFC 200 from top to bottom. I mean, it's just, in my mind, that's probably the biggest one I can think of.
I mean, one of the things that certainly we deal with covering the sport, and I think that some fans do, not every fan. Some fans just tune in for the big fights, but those of us who cover the sport, we will tune in or show up at cage side for the earliest fight of the night, and 6 hours later, we're sitting there still watching, and a main event's happening. It's exhausting.
Yeah, we are stupid people. This is true.
And a lot
I love when they do 3 cards. Like
right, and a lot of times it's not
great sleep.
A lot of times it's not really deserving of that amount of time.
A lot of times, virtually every time.
Almost every. Okay, yeah. But a lot of times you'll be watching and maybe spotted throughout the night. There's a maybe the second prelim, and then 3 fights later there's another one that's pretty good. But it kind of like keeps you going, but it's not really something that's going to make you want to watch from beginning to end. This is a card where, I mean, all those fights you ticked off, you probably ticked off about 6 or 7 fights that every single one of them is something that I'm not going to want to be anywhere but in front of the TV. I'm not going out to Vegas for this one, so I'll be watching this thing on the TV, and I will not be moving from that.
There have been some complaints, and I think they're valid, that this fight, it's not that it's a bad fight, but the Jones-DC rivalry is a little bit exhausting. And I think there is some exhaustion, and I believe that if this fight, God forbid, fell through again, that would really put the UFC in a tough position, because you would need to unify the titles, but just commercially it would be like nauseating. However, those claims aside, I do think, though, that there's still appetite for this. You saw them get there. Jones, I believe, tweeted out ahead of time, if you see DC, boo him mercilessly, which they did. It was amazing to see. As someone who's seen John Jones' fights progress over the years, this command, even if it's a modest audience, in terms of the people who will show up to do that kind of thing, is still crazy. But I really think that come July, yes, people will be sick of it in the way they were kind of sick of Aldo and McGregor, not to the same extent. I guess my point is, you see him up there squabbling, Daniel Cormier's calling him a bum. It's a legitimate fight that we mentioned before. It's a fight that they need. I wouldn't call Jones the big 3 with Ronda and Conor, but he's, in that orbit kind of. it's a fight that's going to sell itself pretty well, don't you think? Like, we're saying, well, it's not McGregor versus Diaz, and it's not. It's still pretty sellable.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Huge stakes, too. I mean, like, when you really think about Daniel Cormier, where he's at in his career, he has the belt. This is the fight that means everything for him. He loses this fight, I don't know what's left in his career. It might be it.
He's categorically said no heavyweight.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it might be it, because he really has nowhere to go at that point. He will have lost to the guy that he detests more than anybody else in the fight game twice, and he's going to have to live with that.
And he's had some momentum since he lost. We lost decisively to John Jones. Let's not kid ourselves, but he's built up some momentum since then. And Jones has lost some momentum. You know, he had 15 months on the sideline with nothing at all, right? Now, if this was the first fight back, if they had fought this past weekend, then we would have been saying, well, you know, who knows what we're going to see from Jones, and there'd be that level of it. But we saw John Jones perform, and I know it was a dominant, unanimous decision victory, but it was not this stupendously talented John Jones, the creativity that we've seen in the past. None of that was out there. It was a pretty safe John Jones, and it's a guy who, again, he dominated the fight, but it was not somebody who you thought, wow, he just showed me something that there's no way that DC can compete with him. So I think it's almost like Jones was one peg down from where he was before, owing probably to the ring rust and so forth. But still, that's the last image we've seen of John Jones is that. And on the other hand, we got DC, who's elevated his game a little bit since he fought. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to go out there and pick DC to beat him, but I think it's going to be, I certainly have anticipation that it's going to be something worth watching.
Right. It's going to be hashtag, to borrow from the boys Dundas and Folks, would watch. Hashtag would watch. Now, I want to switch gears here. We're going to come back to John Jones. This is why the topics are a little weird this week. But we have to get into the Conor McGregor mess, which we'll also use to bridge 197 in here in just a minute. But let's talk Conor McGregor, because we're talking about this main event, UFC 200 now. Conor's officially, like, no matter what you may have thought about the first announcement that he's off the card, no, for real, he's off the card, okay? And we don't know when he's going to be back. Maybe it's 201, maybe it's 202. His team wants 205. We'll figure that out when it happens. The question to you, gentlemen, is, and Chuck, I'll start with you this time, did he overplay his hand? Because here are the facts of the case. Personally speaking, I'm very sympathetic to what he was trying to do. But in looking at it, when Conor McGregor says, I'm not going to do this thing, he's boycotting his own personal services. True. The UFC just keeps running. You're the only one sitting down. They're not sitting down either. And look at who they picked up along the way. As long as they can just pivot to another headliner, what good does you have to have massive amount of leverage to make them bend. And he has a lot, but he doesn't have that much.
No, he doesn't. And it is interesting. I agree with everything. I was basically going to point out what you're talking about is, essentially, the UFC is going to keep going. It's just that's what they do. They put on shows monthly. There's a monthly pay-per-view, and then they put on a bunch of shows around it. I mean, that's just the way it rolls on. They're always in the business of trying to bring up stars. It's one of those situations that's been so polarizing with fans, with media, with fellow fighters. I'm not sure what ultimately it comes down to. I don't know if Conor really thought, like, they'll bend to me on this. And this is that moment when he finally hit a wall with them, and they said, no, we're not doing that. And I felt like, from both sides, it shows how stubborn one side can be versus the other. And it'd be interesting to see if he does show up on one of those cards, or if he waits it out all the way to 205. But in my mind, I think that Conor hurts himself ultimately in the long run, or in the short run, I should say, because he's not getting his money. It's all about his money. He's not worried. He knows he's making UFC money, but the UFC is going to put on a product, and I can guarantee you, I don't know what the numbers are going to be for UFC 200, but like we just were talking about, that's still a very stacked card. It's still going to have a ton of publicity around it. There's going to be a huge push to get that card seen. I don't know what they lose ultimately without McGregor. I still feel like it's going to be a fairly big card, a huge card. So. Ultimately, I feel like this was McGregor seeing how much line he could take, how far he could run with it, and I guess he found his answer.
Not much.
I thought it was interesting that you framed the question in terms of poker. Did he overplay his hand?
Yeah.
And I had someone during the last week tweeted to me, and I wish I could remember the guy who did this, but he said, you don't play poker against guys who own casinos. And the Fertitta brothers.
That's a great line. Wow.
They have they didn't become rich by mistake. Those guys, have seen people try to play their hand against them. Now, what I would say is, I wonder, all this stuff was happening with McGregor his initial tweet, now it seems like ancient history, when he said, I've decided I'm going to retire young, and he never said I'm retiring right now, but he said I'm going to retire young, and then he came back out with his long manifesto on Facebook talking about why he was still in Iceland, and he was talking about wanting to train and wanting to get better, and he said all the right things. All this happened while the status of Daniel Cormier was still up in the air. Daniel Cormier still had to go to his doctor and get cleared. Yeah. What would happen? Where would we be sitting right now if Cormier had gone to the doctor and the doctor said, I don't think you're quite ready. I think you need to wait till October to fight. Then I think maybe we'd be in a different situation. Well, we would clearly be in a different situation. I don't know whether the UFC would then have figured out some way to keep McGregor on this card, or whether they would have gone to plan C or plan D or plan E or whatever. But that would have been an interesting thing. I just think that McGregor, I think he maybe overestimated his leverage, but I think this was something he kind of was always aiming to do anyway. He's been talking forever.
We've been watching the UFC basically tailor everything to Conor McGregor since for the last year at least, right? Like anything basically he's kind of wanted. I feel like the UFC's been okay with. They put on a press conference. He shows up late. That's okay. This is part of his charm. It's part of what he does. I feel like that.
But it's hard to argue they did that detrimentally.
True. It's true. And I mean, when you have people, media, fighters especially, who are just like, hey, this guy with the special treatment, this guy with the special treatment, that's hitting the UFC's vanity too. This is a company that has got to where it's at by sticking to its guns and by being as audacious as that's been. I mean, I really believe that's how they've gotten to where they're at. And publicly, they've just been like, oh, look at this. Conor controls the UFC. Conor doing this. Conor doing that.
Right.
And I feel like this is that moment when the UFC is like, man, I've heard that enough. You know what I mean? If it goes public, this is our public stance on this.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and they have. We didn't hear anybody else talking about having a glass of whiskey with Fertitas, or all the things are driving around in a fancy sport car that was provided by the UFC. All these things, it's all true. This is all part of what built up McGregor to be the superstar that he has become, and it was all going to the point where he was going to see where his power ended, if it indeed would end. I think it was perfectly understandable for him to make this ploy, because even if he overextended his hand, what does he lose? He loses the payday of being associated with UFC 200, but now he'll be associated with UFC 201 or UFC 202, and he'll make that into a huge thing. So maybe it might cost him some dollars, but I think in his mind it was worthwhile to at least make the gambit.
I think that we found out that the C in UFC doesn't stand for Conor.
Yes, we did, Chuck. That's a very astute observation.
But what does the FU stand for?
Yes.
Here's the question that I've been sort of pondering. And what if someone said to you, so for example, there have been a couple of numbers thrown around I've seen. Darren Rovell was like, UFC 200 is going to lose $45 million as a consequence. Front Row Brian, who I think actually has some expertise in this matter, said roughly 23 mil. Let's split the difference and say roughly 30 million or so. That's how much they're giving up as a consequence. If someone asked you, what is the tax, if there was such a thing, that the UFC would be willing to pay in order to preserve the hierarchy, that is them first and fighter second, and someone says it's 30 million, do you think the UFC would hesitate for an instant to pay that? In other words, the amount of money they'd be willing to invest in that policy, that world reality, is, to me, greatly exceeds 30, 45, frankly even a couple $100 million, because the long run gains of that are astronomically high in their favor as a consequence.
Yeah, but we challenge those numbers. First of all, Rovell, the ESPN guy,
I'm not citing Rovell as a math authority, trust me, I'm just listening.
His $45 million was including, he said $70 per pay-per-view. First of all, pay-per-views cost $50 if you get standard def, $60 if you get high def, right? So there's no 70, and even if you take the 60, the UFC doesn't get all of it. The cable company or the satellite. So right there, the math is way off. But even if we accepted the math, or we go with Front Row Brian's numbers instead, that's still looking at that one event in a vacuum. It's looking at, let's look at it a little more macro and say we've got UFC 200, we've got UFC 201. Let's say Conor McGregor headlining 200 would make this amount of money, and then 201 would make this little tiny amount of money. Well, now maybe if McGregor's on 201, it's making that amount of money, and UFC 200 goes down a little bit.
Right, but you would agree, though, maybe you wouldn't, but it seems to me you could say you can have Diaz fight on another card after 200, you can have McGregor fight on another card after 200, even separately, but there's something about the magic, McGregor, Diaz, UFC 200 together that's uniquely special. No? Or am I off?
I mean, I don't know that I would acknowledge that as necessarily true.
Okay.
I think it's certainly possible, but I think there is some ceiling to where UFC events are going to rise in terms of the amount of pay-per-views they can sell. And yes, I think that I agree that McGregor Diaz, or just a McGregor fight. I mean, I also to go to an aside here. I think actually if it was a McGregor fight that had more meaning, even though I love Nate Diaz, and I think there's a lot of dissension on whether that was a fight that really had much meaning. And I think that the people who love McGregor were excited for it, but I think a lot of other people are like, I don't know, this is not a. But anyway, the people who think that fight really is going to sell big on 200, you still have to acknowledge that he is going to greatly inflate the sales for whatever event he's on.
Sure.
So I don't know that it becomes a net loss.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you to the extent like UFC 200 seems like it should have the biggest star on it, right? Like so I feel like there is a certain amount, but I agree with you too because basically wherever McGregor ends up, if he ends up on that New York card, that card probably becomes bigger in terms of eyes and everything that's going to happen with it than UFC 200. So I feel like it's just really. It's sort of postponing. It's not so much that you're losing this amount of money. It's just that you're delaying that amount of money, or maybe you know what I'm saying, or you're parsing it out over time.
I think that circles back to one of my previous points, which is like only Conor McGregor is sitting out. The UFC train just keeps leaving the station. And to your point, 199 is not a bad pay-per-view, but 198 is great. 200 is great. We'll see what they do with 1, 2, 3, and 4. They have to fill those holes. But you can imagine 5 is going to have, even if there's injuries to the card, there's going to be some momentum to it. UFC is doing good. Yeah. They're doing good. Like this idea that they've had their arm twisted behind their back to make accommodations for one guy, even if what I think he's asking is frankly a really modest concession. Right. I don't know where the power leverage is coming from.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think that it comes down to this. There are certain events that have a built-in buzz. UFC 200 has a built-in buzz. UFC 205 happening down the block here at the Garden.
Yep, totally.
Those are fight cards that are going to do well no matter what.
Right.
And then you've got this your golden goose, Conor McGregor, and you could also say, Ronda Rousey. Those are a couple people who sell a lot. Well, why not put one of them on one of those fight cards in the middle that otherwise would be, kind of downselling? Those are fight cards that need a little bit of a boost. And so now you could have 3 big events. You could have 200, 205, and then one of the ones in the middle.
And McGregor's
with
that
McGregor
bridge in between the two.
Yeah.
It's interesting that we're at this moment, at this sort of crossroads, I guess, with McGregor and the UFC,
Yep.
coming off of a loss and where they were basically tailoring an arbitrary weight that they fought out the first time, tailoring it all for him again to do this, and then they get hung up on some detail like this. You pointed out one time pretty well that it's the straw, the straw that breaks it's because it's already been in place a long time, so that's why it's the straw that ends up breaking the back. This is one of those situations. I just feel like Conor McGregor probably thought he was going to be able to get his, be able to train and get his mind back and whatever he was presenting, and the UFC just was like, not this time. This is it. So it's just an interesting thing coming off a loss, that the leverage play right here, and that I feel like Conor McGregor's star is only that much bigger coming out of that loss.
Totally.
And I know at the time we were wondering like, how much does this hurt him? It turns out not that much for him to lose that fight.
And look, here's another situation another fact of the situation that should, I think, be recognized. It's not over. Yeah. To your point, DC did get cleared and they did make the fight. But what if there's an injury 6 weeks from now? Now, will Conor McGregor be available? I don't know, but it will certainly make him look wise for having this. Oh my God, he would rake people over the. Would he not gloat? I mean, not gloat necessarily, but I don't think he'd be silent on Twitter. You might get a smiley face, Dana White style, would you not?
Yes.
But here's the thing that I also want to consider is that we had this. Like, where was the fault line on this dispute? It was around whether or not a fighter has to be, per the terms of the contract, which actually calls for a reasonable amount, essentially, of promotion. What does it mean to be reasonable? This is where we all discussed it. I think he raised some interesting questions that are worth examining. Should fighters, especially headliners, should they be paid? Now, you can have a different perspective on it. I think reasonable people can agree or disagree, but he raised those. But here's the question for you, gentlemen, and then we'll move on to 197. I don't think this battle's over. The battle along the particular fault line is probably over, but the battle now to maybe get concessions written into contracts to do everything up front or wherever this is going to move, this power struggle between McGregor and UFC, it's going to shift somewhere else in the course of the relationship. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think actually it's going to be the fighters in general. There's going to be something different going on. I kind of wonder whether McGregor, at the time this was coming up, I thought, wow, McGregor is the guy who can, if anybody's going to get the UFC to change the way it operates, it's going to be McGregor. But in retrospect, now I look at it and I think, you know what? He didn't get a lot of support from fellow fighters, of fighters who were,
I thought Jose Aldo's tweets were shocking.
Yeah, but he has an axe to grind in a big way. Whereas I think that some of the other people.
I get why he did it because it's short-term gain. But after everything he said and done, then to be like, I showed up to my promotional duties at UFC, at Reebok. I mean, this is so inauthentic.
Yeah, I was not too impressed by him. But I thought that some of the other people, Misha Tate, Cain Velasquez came out and said something. Frankie Edgar said stuff. So McGregor did not get a lot of support. Now, you show up at these big press conferences with all these UFC fighters, some of the cream of the crop in the fight game, all sitting on the stage with you, and you start like picking them off one by one, talking about how they're bums and how you're the greatest. You're not going to expect to get a lot support from people.
Yep, you're right.
So I think if the UFC had, if the fighters were represented by somebody who had a little bit more. Who was a little bit less just about him. I mean, McGregor, face it, he talks about elevating the game for everybody else, but it's really been about him and whoever happens to be in the cage with him on that particular night. And I think if there was somebody else who had a little bit more of an ability to rein in other fighters, because you said, McGregor loses out on his UFC 200 night, but the UFC moves on. Well, that's because everybody else is going to right lockstep, march along, and nobody else cares.
It's a completely different moment in time right now because going into UFC 193, Ronda Rousey seemed completely fatigued with her press schedule. When she went into that fight, it seemed like she was over it. She wanted nothing more to do with it. And
she was hanging up on conference calls.
And that's
thanks, Mark Raimondi.
Yeah, you did it again. but basically, she was over it. But her and McGregor both are what we consider the transcendent stars. What they busted the seam of like what we do normally within MMA world. They're all over the place. They're not just their press up. What they're doing in media is not just. The usual stuff that the UFC has set up. This is all over now. It's morning shows. It's every kind of thing. It's the stuff that MMA never got before. These are the two stars that are doing it, and that's a new level that they're dealing in. Conor McGregor particularly is known for it. He's always on. He's on. If you're interviewing Conor McGregor, he's always going to be the guy who's bringing that energy. Imagine how fatiguing that is, especially when you lose a fight. You're trying to retune and refocus. It's almost like the demon he created, or like the spotlight he created and made as big as it is. Now he has to get out of it. Then it's a tough thing to do. And I felt like that's what you saw with Ronda Rousey is. It's like unparalleled. It's unprecedented. Like so the type of press she was getting in the UFC, and then you get Conor McGregor, same thing, and that's got to be very, very fatiguing. It's easy to think like, well, it's just New York, or it's just whatever. But there's so much more that they deal with on a daily basis now. You know what I'm saying? Like they're true celebrities. So I feel like they're probably hounded, and it's an energy expense in every possible way.
Yeah, and to your point, I think you're sort of approaching that. You're talking about what is being expected of these fighters. Can the contracts change? Well, what Frankie Edgar or Jose Aldo was expected to do is much different from what Conor McGregor is expected to do. Not to say that the UFC is setting all that stuff up, but he was doing things that were above and beyond what those other guys were doing promotionally. Mm-hmm. And aside from the actual time and the amount of interviews he was doing, he also brings a kind of energy to it that, and look, I think that he brought a kind of authenticity to it as well. There was something about listening to Conor McGregor promote a fight that didn't always sound like he was just giving you the rote, I'm just going to try to promote a fight thing. He really sounded like he believed every word that he was speaking, and that's a skill. That's a skill, and I think the UFC. Might have used a little more discretion in giving him a little more leeway, but that's just not the way they operate.
It is not the way they operate. And again, I don't think this is over, so we'll see how it progresses as the weeks and months pass. And whenever McGregor gets on a fight card, that's going to be very interesting to see, because I don't know if it's going to be 201 or 202. It could be 205. despite what UFC brass might say. All right, so let's go back in time. So we've kind of done like a circle here. The only way to make sense of it. So let's go back to UFC 197. Now that we've got the 200 Conor McGregor stuff behind us, John Jones winning, Demetrius Johnson winning. There's a lot to get to there. Let's start with John Jones, the headliner. He beats Ovince St. Preux. In a weird performance. He tweets the next day, sometimes Michael Jordan had 20 points, sometimes he had 60, which was kind of an admission of a shortcoming. He won all 5 rounds. One judge gave him 50-44, but I guess perception-wise, Chuck, when that fight was over, A, how do you think he looked? And B, I don't think he's taking a hit because he's going to get this boost off the Cormier thing. 100%. But there was definitely a little bit of head scratching about who John Jones is going to be, right?
Certainly helped to have Daniel Cormier actually on the mic as he's fighting, right? Because that just adds to the whole setup to this thing. But it was an odd performance. I felt like you didn't know. 15. I know you've been talking about ring rust and being a real thing, and these types of things, and how Dominic Cruz comes along and does something completely unfathomable by looking the way he did. John Jones, I didn't really feel like he showed a ton of that, but then again, you think he wasn't really pulling the trigger like he used to. He's not. His creativity in his striking game seemed a little like he wasn't, he was keeping things holstered. He didn't have that killer instinct. I thought that translated immediately in the fight. You could tell he didn't want to taste any of OSP's power. And you kept thinking he was trying to set something up. I felt like the pattern there was that he just didn't have that killer instinct or something like that. And that's what was missing from it for me. Like when we used to watch a John Jones fight, if you go back to the Hua fight or any of those ones when he was coming up and winning the belt and all those fights, the subsequent fights, it seemed like he really was trying to put a guy away pretty quick.
Dropping Machida to the canvas, exactly. Eyes open.
Yeah.
That's crazy,
I mean,
right?
Those types of things. And I think that's the expectation on a guy like him. So when you see him go in there and it looks like it didn't seem like timing. It just seemed like he was very hesitant to put himself in any dangerous spots. And I felt like he dominated it, but he did it in such a safe way, if you'd say it. He only got hit twice. He was saying where it really mattered, and it translated for me. There's certain fights that take on a narrative right away, and I felt like that's what it came out. I felt like the fight was going to go the whole way as long as OSP held out, which he did throughout. But I just felt like I didn't see the John Jones explosiveness that you're used to seeing.
Yeah, I
Jeff?
felt the same way. Chuck said it. I mean, I felt as though John Jones did not lose. He went out there and said, I'm not going to lose. I'm not going to take damage. It was as though he was already plotting in his mind that he wanted the UFC 200 date, and he wanted.
And he admitted that too.
Yeah,
he said it explicitly.
Yeah.
So I guess it was that watching the fight, I thought it was like 5 round ones for me. I was expecting round 1 to go pretty much the way the entire fight went, which John Jones just sort of getting his sea legs back, testing the water, see how he does, and then once he recognizes distance, all the things that he needed to do in order to feel comfortable back in the octagon, then round 2 was going to come out and he was going to just take care of this guy. Mm-hmm. And it just didn't happen. It was 5 round ones where there was never a moment where I thought that OSP was in the fight or was going to. I mean, I know he has power, but there was never a moment where he was close to landing something and, oh man, Jones just missed that. There was not much chance there.
You were in the building, and I could hear the boos from the telecast. But I mean, you were in there. When's the last time? I mean, I just don't feel like you've seen too many John Jones fights where boos rain down on him. You know what I mean, or rain down on the fight. Yeah,
they're usually at the weigh-ins, and then the screams are usually what happens during the course of the fight. It was backwards this time.
So I mean, to me, that's just it. I just didn't think it had any particular excitement. It was a main event. And maybe it was because we were talking about Demetrius Johnson, but we'll
get to DJ in a second. But the question is there harm suffered there for him?
I don't think so. I mean, he got by a guy he had to take on short notice, who probably shouldn't have been in that situation yet. This particular time, because in the past, we've seen UFC 151 where he didn't take on the short notice opponent. This time he had just enough time. Greg Jackson explained that's just enough time to tweak everything and get ready. But it's a guy that you weren't expecting. It's a guy that becomes dangerous because you have no emotional. It's just a guy at that point, an opponent that you need to get through to get to the guy that you want to get to. And he admitted that. I felt like he did what he needed to do, and I mean, you know how the fans are in this sport, man. If he goes in there and knocks out Daniel Cormier, we're going to be talking about John Jones again and the craziest, superlatives we can. But I feel like he probably coasted someone. It probably was a mixture of all those things. But I feel like he'll get it. He'll get it back. All it takes is one big performance for him to get that back.
And okay, let's think about it in terms of how it leads to the next one. I mean, I'll pose the question to you. You're Joe fan, or you're Donk Donkerson.
Yes.
You may be buying. You're going to buy.
Certainly am.
You have $60 in your wallet. That you need to spend, and you're thinking about buying the UFC pay-per-view, and you're thinking, okay, John Jones just went out there and torched OSP, and now you're thinking, geez, he already beat Daniel Cormier pretty decisively. Now he went out there and torched OSP, let's say the way that Demetrius Johnson took Henry Cejudo out. Let's say Jones did that. I'm not sure I would be all that willing to spend my $60. I'm thinking this guy is just amazing. He's killing this guy. Now he's going to go out. He's going to destroy DC. But the performance that Jones had, I'm not going to say that I'm going to pick DC, but I'm at least having that little bit of doubt. Like maybe this is the John Jones that we're going to see from now on.
It is hilarious because you were talking about this earlier. It's like it's funny how we go from he's going to destroy OSP to, man, he would have gotten beat if Cormier, like just the narrative shift, all in that stuff.
We always talk about how fighters have to fool themselves into believing that they're invincible, and I think in some ways that fans have to 100%. Fool ourselves into believing that there's a possibility that this is actually going to be a real fight. I mean, look, the fight that was going to happen. We saw Nate Diaz choke out Conor McGregor pretty effortlessly in the second round of that fight, but still there are a lot of people who want to see them go at it again because there are people that believe.
Yeah, being a fan of the fight game is to revise your, to complete your belief system on the fly all the time.
The universe changes month over month.
So from that perspective, I think that the Jones performance, in a way, makes it a better sell, makes that UFC 200 main event a better sell, because maybe instead of it being John Jones way up here in the stratosphere in DC, good but not quite there. We saw John Jones come down a little bit. And he's still better than everybody else on the planet probably, but that performance made him at least seem like someone that might be touchable.
So that was the narrative I was going to ask about, which was the two things I mentioned before. I've already seen this. I don't care about this. Chuck, do you agree? Is it going to be that, or is Jeff right? The other narrative that, hey, that was that could have been really competitive. Is that going to win out?
I don't know, man. On some of just during the press conference yesterday, I had so many people, giving me the oh my God, that was so boring. This is so boring. But it's
I got the opposite.
Yeah, I saw both, but I did see a lot of people saying that, and I thought, man, that couldn't have been. I thought it was great the way that they were back. It was very natural hatred between those two guys now. It's they're going at each other, and John Jones was completely comfortable.
And saying really hurtful things to each other.
I know.
You know what I mean?
It's crazy to me. And I'm like, to me, that's only going to escalate, and it's been building there. I mean, that's what it's about. I feel like ultimately when we get to it, hopefully we get to it, and those guys get to come together, because bad blood translates. When it's that long in the making, it translates very, very well. I think when it comes down to it, it just feeds into the whole thing. It becomes emotional. If you're vicariously going through your characters, the guys that you like to watch, you can't help but feel some of that, as you're watching them go in there and it bubbles over.
Very, very quickly, did you like the photo with them with the two belts?
Yeah, I mean, it's promotion. I look at that one belt and I'm like, that belt doesn't mean anything, but looking at it visually,
it looks cool.
In this case, though, it sort of makes sense.
It looks cool.
Right?
It looks cool.
It's cool, and besides that, John Jones was stripped of his belt. So it's like you really do have two champions coming together.
Yeah, that's very cool. So let's talk about the other champion on that card, which is frankly because the more interesting conversation, I actually think. Because before the 200 fight was announced, I feel like John was stewing in all these questions, and they made 200, and a lot of that got swept away. So let's talk about Demetrius Johnson. I have a theory here, and it's very much based on anecdotal evidence. But if you look at Ariel's post-fight interview with him, I did my Monday Morning Analyst podcast about it, thinking for sure, well, I did one on DJ, this is about to tank, and it didn't. It did double the normal views for that podcast does on average. And I was like, wow, there really is some discussion about him. The Kotaku blog was talking about him today, about how underappreciated he is. And the conversation, I feel like, has shifted. It's gone from, wow, he's really good, but underappreciated. Maybe he belongs in the pound-for-pound list somewhere at the top, to, okay, is he number one or is he number two?
Right.
It took a jump. And I feel like I don't agree with the analysis, Jeff, that he is the top one. But I believe you can make a strong case for it. I think people who believe that are entirely reasonable. Did Demetrius Johnson, I don't know if he became a star overnight, but did he turn a corner at 197?
Well, yeah, and I think we give a little bit of an assist to John Jones, because remember, Mighty Mouse was fighting in the co-main event, and which is something he's done quite often, and it's very easy to then become overlooked when the main event happens, and look at when the last time these two guys were co-main and main event was when the night that Demetrius Johnson won the championship. So he won the championship that night on a split decision. Then John Jones comes out there, almost loses by armbar to Vitor Belfort, and then beats the crap out of Vitor. And people sort of forgot about the Demetrius Johnson winning the first, becoming the first flyweight champion of the UFC. This time, Demetrius Johnson goes out there and just torches a Olympic gold medal wrestler and beats him at his own game, the clinch game, the one thing that Cejudo could have reasonably expected himself to have superiority in, no superiority, because Demetrius Johnson just beat him up. Then, when that ends and there's still some buzz about that quick knockout, what happens? We get a main event that's kind of a slow plodding dud, 5 rounds, not that exciting. And so the buzz that Mighty Mouse might have created didn't get squashed by something that happened right after. So I would say I'll give John Jones an assist, and I will also say that I'm ready to put Demetrius Johnson at the top of the list right now, with knowing that John Jones has an opportunity on July 9th to just jump right back over him.
Chuck, what was your take on the whole thing?
I felt like he did turn a corner somehow. I don't know how to explain this, but sometimes you watch somebody who's been around and you've seen him for a long time do great things, underappreciated, whatever, but you just see somehow it clicks. There's some kind of benign force behind it that just says it looks really good. That's what happened, I felt like. Something felt very good about watching him fight this fight, and to see him kind of come out there against a guy who's the wrestler that we thought, we didn't know if he was ready for this challenge or not, to go in there and fight Mighty Mouse. But at the same time, he certainly had tools that might nullify any aesthetics or anything else that could go into that fight. He could have, we might have seen him chip away and get the thing done over a course of a 5-round fight. You just never know. But for him to handle himself the way he did, Mighty Mouse, and really make Cejudo looked like he did not belong in the cage with him is a pretty amazing feat. This wasn't Chris Carriazo or even Horiguchi.
John Moraga.
The guys. I mean, there's guys like those guys are very good fighters, but I felt like this was that weird one coming in.
This was a lifelong elite athlete.
100%.
Daniel Cormier always talks about what's the difference between Miesha Tate and Ronda Rousey. A number of things. Ronda Rousey's a lifelong athlete.
Yeah, and even in just his introduction, he's so blurry, so fast. He's doing all this stuff. I feel like it's finally translating. That's what I believe. I think people have seen him enough. We're getting enough coats where we're finally saying, okay, I get what he does now. That's where it comes down. And then you see him perform, and it's this great aesthetic beauty that he puts out there. And I think it's finally translating.
And also, I feel like all the stars were aligned in this one. Cejudo comes out and pretty quickly takes Demetrius Johnson down to the canvas. Now, he wasn't on the canvas for more than, if you blinked, you missed it. Now, but still, it happened.
True.
And that gives me the immediate, in that moment, I remember thinking, oh, okay, Cejudo can do this. Whereas maybe about 30 seconds earlier when they were just getting ready to fight, I'm thinking, well, Mighty Mouse is going to beat this guy. I'm not sure, I wasn't expecting it to go the way that it went, but I'm still thinking, okay, Mighty Mouse has got this. Then when I see him get taken down immediately, all of a sudden my opinion of Cejudo goes up, and then all of a sudden I'm watching that guy that was the only moment he had in that fight, and the rest of it was just all downhill.
It's crazy because for years there was this line that was tossed off by Dana White, who had asked about guys like GSP, et cetera, et cetera. When are they going to move up to a super fight? As soon as he cleans out a division, right? It's always this theoretical that could never really happen because there's always this crop of people coming up. I think we're at that point with Demetrius Johnson too, where you're just like, wow, if anybody's cleaned out their division, it's him. I mean, there's just not a lot of guys.
We're talking about facing Benavidez for the third time.
Exactly. And at the time when
he's the second best guy out there.
It's been an amazing run. When they made the 125-pound division, I was of the opinion that it was tailor-made for Benavidez. I thought he was going to be a guy we'd be sitting here talking about, to beat him those times. And you think back, because I know you were in the building in Washington when he fought Dominic Cruz. What a crazy, in retrospect, that's one of the craziest fights you can imagine now. I think those two guys coming together again would just be an amazing fight.
Is he pound for pound best in your mind?
See, I would still go with John Jones. I just think that he's demonstrated against such top guys, and he's really rendered them old, moot, just put them away, just the way he did it. And for so long, he's just been that dominant. But it gets closer and closer. I used to have John Jones, and for the last couple of years, John Jones and everybody else. But I feel like now
it's super tight.
Yeah, Demetrius Johnson's right there.
I think it's a very tight race. You know what I love about DJ right now is that like I think he kind of just said, I'm going to be immune to criticism. I just have to do what I want to do. He's the king of Twitch, and then he goes out and just knuckles you to the canvas. And I think people are like, that's kind of cool to just be who you are. Maybe he's not going to be, Conor McGregor ever in his life, but now that he's being authentic, and you marry that with, he's in the conversation with Anderson Silva's and George St. Pierre's now, it has completely reformed him. Not completely. It has modestly, I think, beginning to reform him.
There was a knock on 125ers. I think a lot of people didn't think you'd see a lot of finishes. He's finished 3 of his last 4 guys. He has a flair for dramatics. The Horiguchi fight where he does it at the very end. I mean, those things, I feel like that's what I'm saying. Over a course of time, you start to look at him and you're like, wow, this guy is... It's pretty amazing watching him fight now. Like, it's becoming a real event. I feel like that was what was missing before. You couldn't say event with him. For some reason, it just wasn't translating. I feel like we're at the point. That's where we turn the corner. He's become an event.
Yeah, he's collected enough bodies now where he has a nice little collection. It's worth taking a look at. I don't know if he's going to jump to 135. I know that record's important to him. I think he could do it and not fight Cruz, fight a contender, and it would still be kind of interesting. Real quickly, is there anyone at 135 aside from Cruz you'd like to see him fight if he decides to go up there? I think a fight with John Lineker would be kind of crazy.
Be amazing. Yeah, especially given that Lineker was in his division.
Or a rematch with Dillashaw, I think would be amazing. Is anyone else you'd like?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking that unless he fights for that belt, I don't know that he's going to move up. He really wants. He every single time you hear him talking, he's always referring to that Anderson Silva thing, and he's 2 fights away, 2 more defenses away. And they'll find somebody to put in there with him.
Chuck, what do they do with the Ultimate Fighter now? They canceled the tryouts. I mean, can you imagine that? Some poor guy off tough has to go fight.
It sounds so much more absurd a week later. You know, it's like
Demetrius Johnson would have had a Mortal Kombat fatality. Liu Kang, I mean, Shang Tsung turns into the dragon, eats half his body. Mortal Kombat 2 kind of fatality. Can you imagine this? Yeah. So what do they do now?
I don't know. At first, I thought Ariel's idea of basically maybe reheating some of the flyweights that are sort of in that mix of, well, we have nowhere to go. Maybe you bring them in and put them in some kind of modified situation where they're contending. But I don't know. The division itself is just very difficult to get guys. It's just a smaller body type. You don't have as many people fighting in it, so it's going to be an issue, I think. But I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know how you make that compelling.
Couple more guys to get to with the remaining time. Anthony Pettis, 3 losses in a row. We talked about that, Chuck. Crossing the bridge to nowhere. Well, Jeff, he has crossed it.
Yeah.
Why has he crossed it, and what the hell are they going to do now?
Boy, I don't know why. Boy, if there was ever a fight that was tailor-made for him, it was Barbosa. It was a guy who's not going to try to take him down, who's going to stand there and trade with him, and who's going to allow him to utilize his strength. And boy, it was his strength did not have much to show, and Barbosa really did. That was a real telling fight. I mean, I gave Pettis a bit of a pass after the Alvarez fight because he had a guy who grappled with him and he just couldn't contend with it. But here's a guy who's going out there and striking with him. That's his strength, and struck with him and outstruck him, beat him to the punch, beat him to the kick. What next? I mean, I don't know. It seems like people go to a different weight class. I'm not sure whether he can drop down
to 145
some pounds, but
he was going to.
He says he can make it.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, that might be the best route for a guy like that to sort of how people they go through reinvention mode. Him going into this fight, I felt like he was giving you that sort of thought. Like, you know what, man, I got back to what I do. I got back to, he felt getting hungry again and all this stuff. And you're right, he was tailor-made. This was a guy who was going to strike with him. This is Showtime, right? This guy who's going to do with the dynamic striking game. He was jumping off a fence and everything. He had a guy who was going to accommodate him, and he got picked apart at that. That's what glares at me. I'm like, wow, how severely this corner has been turned, because December of 2014, we're doing a big Wheaties unveiling, and there's Anthony Pettis, and we're all sitting there thinking like this.
It's here in the studio.
It's like you're thinking at the time like this is a guy who's a transcendent star. He is so good. He was walking through guys like Benson, Henderson, and all the
twice.
Twice, and just the way he did it out in a Milwaukee card or wherever it was. It's just I felt like he was at that spot. Nurmagomedov was in the crowd, basically challenging him, and Anthony Pettis was like, "Yes, I told you I'd fight you. Let's do this." And it was just. It's a crazy thing. The world was his whole thing. Three fights later, 0-3, and that RDA, RDA. I don't know what happened. Maybe if that's the fight, but just taking that beating he did,
Right.
So that might be the one.
Okay, so this is my question, and I don't know what the answer is either. I'm as clueless as anyone else on this topic. I have the two theories that seem to make the most sense to me, and of course, everyone always has the post-USADA boogeyman. Is it USADA? I mean, it could be. I don't know, but he's never failed a test, so that's not at the forefront of my mind. His physique has not rapidly changed in any kind of way, but that doesn't mean anything necessarily, but you get the idea. The two competing theories for me are one, that beating RDA gave him was so authoritative. I don't put it at the same level as Franklin Loiseau, but it's not too far away.
Yeah.
And then the other one is, I talked to Brian Stan. Brian Stan's belief is that it wasn't the RDA fight, although that wasn't awesome for him, but that he had this early technical advantage in certain respects. The game just caught up with him, and he hasn't reinvested. Does that sound plausible to you?
That sounds completely plausible. I think that he thought he was, and he was demonstrated he's above most of the fighters in the striking game. I mean, he showed it in plenty of times. He also was very good in scrambles and things like that. I do feel like
he had great footwork.
Yeah, he did, and I feel like somewhere along the way, I don't know, it's probably a combination of those two things, but certainly, and we see it not just with Pettis, with a lot of guys. Such a psychological game, and sometimes you're mentally you can't correct it. You just turn that corner, you can't correct it.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with it. Not so much the physical. I mean, I get what you're saying, that the game has caught up to some extent with people can handle his striking, but there's also something mental going on that, he left. He left the Rufus camp for a little bit to go down and train with the Greg Jackson team, with his one-time opponent Donald Cerrone and all the other guys down there. Not to say that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing to go get a different look sometimes. But guys who are really confident in what they've got aren't necessarily going to do that. I think that that's the kind of thing you do. I think when you're searching for something, and whatever it was that he was searching for. Now I could see if he was fighting against Khabib or somebody who he was thinking, this guy's going to take me down and Clay Guida me. But he was fighting against a guy. Could you imagine him facing anybody who he would have more confidence against than a guy who is also really known as a striker? You would have thought that would have been the kind of opponent that he would have been very confident against. But still, he went out searching for something different. And so I'm, whether it's physically not quite where he was, whether it's mentally, whether he's just exhausted. But yeah, he needs something, with some kind of deep breather to step back and reinvent himself somehow.
It's so crazy though when we see these things. We've talked about other people who've just taken, like they're on nice winning streaks or they've demonstrated nothing but superiority, and all of a sudden it just stops for them. And he's too young. He had too much upside for that to seem like it would happen to him. So I know a couple people are like, oh, we saw this coming, but I have to say that I'm more shocked by Pettis than about anybody. I just never saw that.
It doesn't
coming.
shock me when anyone loses in MMA, but 3 in a row I would have never predicted on the eve of UFC 185. And that's just never. Let's quickly, with the time remaining, talk about one more guy. We'll talk about 2 more guys, but one more guy in detail. Benson Henderson, you were there, Chuck, loses to Andrei Koreshkov. Now, of course, last week on the beat, I'm like, he's as close to a sure thing as there is in MMA. Nailed it. So I got it totally wrong. Okay, I don't mind being wrong about fights. MMA is crazy. Crazy things happen all the time. But if you had told me, Chuck, that before that fight, that Benson Henderson not only would not get a takedown, he wouldn't even get close on one attempt, I would have told you you're crazy, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
So tell me what happened in your mind, your thoughts about it, and was it good or bad for Bellator?
Okay. So on the first part, I had my doubts when I saw them stand together at the little media day they did at the Mohegan Sun. They stood together, and it was immensely different. I mean, Koreshkov was looked like a Hulk next to him, and I thought. I even asked Benson Henderson at the time, I'm like, how's your weight, man? And he's like, oh, man, this is great. 170 is great because he doesn't have to cut any weight. But I'm like, look at the dude's a monster, So basically, I started having my doubts then about what was going to happen in the fight. But I still thought Benson Henderson, being as savvy as he is, having fought the kind of guys he has, been through so many great training partners, all the things that he brings to it, I just thought he would be able to get it done against Koreshkov in the end because of the lack of experience. Right. And we also remember the Ben Askren fight. I mean, it's hard. I
can't get it out of my head.
That's what I'm saying. So you always remember that, and you think, well, Benson Henderson, maybe he's not going to mug him like Ben Askren did, but he'll get it done. I kept thinking that. But you could see it shut down on the very first couple attempts, and you thought, it's not going to be his night. You knew immediately that he was not going to get that done. He better have a plan B, and ultimately he didn't. I didn't even feel like he could even get his range set up. He was taking big wild swings, just not coming close.
He had the good head movement.
Yeah.
In jiu-jitsu, they always tell you the 3 stages of development are survival, defending, and attack.
Yeah.
That was survival.
Yeah.
That's how much of a mismatch that was.
To address your second thing, I mean, I thought it was great for Bellator because you have a guy that you bring in, who's supposedly the big free agent signing, and he's a former champion in the UFC. Now, there is the asterisk because he was fighting at 170, which he hadn't done a lot of, but he looked pretty good at 170 in his last 2 fights coming in.
He beat Jorge Masvidal, controversially, but Masvidal is a quality fighter.
So he goes in there, and he fights your champion who nobody's talking about, and your champion mauls him like that. That looks great for Bellator. They've got a guy who is that dominant that's just been on their roster, and you think always at that point, like just like with Strikeforce, well, when they came in the UFC, how many of those guys went up the ranks? There's really good talent outside the UFC. You just have to sometimes pay attention to it. And it didn't hurt Benson Henderson because all it did was play out like an exhibit, like, hey man, you might not want to fight at 170 anymore.
Yeah, I agree with Chuck's assessment of the big picture for Bellator. Anytime you can bring somebody in who's a very high-level guy from your competing organization, and Ben Henderson came in there and just mauled him, and then I'm sure they would have found a way to turn the narrative in their favor, but they now can say, well, our existing guy, our champion, took care of business against this guy. That's a win for Bellator, I think, and the fact that Henderson was fighting against a guy much bigger. It wasn't just big. I mean, I could stand next to Ben Henderson. I look like the amazing Hulk next to Ben Henderson, but he's going to still whip my ass. And he was fighting against a guy who was a quality fighter, who has improved immensely since the days when Ben Askren was fighting against him. So that also, you thought, okay, well, Askren just beat this guy up. Now he's a whole different guy, and that's a good thing for Bellator.
My thought after like a week later was like, you know what? A Koreshkov-Askren rematch doesn't sound that bad.
You should have heard him too. I asked.
He was murdering him on Twitter. Yeah.
I asked Koreshkov right afterward, like, hey, was there silver linings? So you look at it now and think like that was necessary for me to lose that fight the way I did, for me to turn around and fix the problems I have. And he's like, he was basically, I beat myself before that fight, and he said, I would kill him. He used that word, I would kill him if we fought again. I would kill him. I said, and Mike Chiappa was saying, he was like, did you say kill him? He's like, I would kill him. He was just angry about it. I was like, man, at that moment I was like, I wish so bad they could put that one back together.
That is great. We have just a minute or two or so, or roughly something like that remaining. I want to end on a positive note if we can. This week it was announced by Paddy Houlihan, one of the guys from SBG Dublin, that his career is over. He has a very rare, essentially blood clotting disease. So it affects just the most tiny amount of the population. So what I guess I wanted to ask was your favorite Paddy Houlihan moment, and you don't have to be super specific with it. For me, I'm just going to say the fact that he was part of that card. I forget which fight night it was. It was McGregor versus Brandao. I don't know the number anymore.
46.
46. Okay.
Yeah.
It was July of 2014, and it was him, Gunnar Nelson, who's not Irish, but of course is a part of that team. But it was more than that. Neil Seary was on it. Even the Northern Irish Norman Park was on it. And it was the night that McGregor announced, we're not here to take part, we're here to take over. Right. And then he later on wound up being able to headline in a show in Ireland. And I just thought, not a lot of guys get to represent their country in that way. I've never got a chance. I was a U.S. Marine. That doesn't mean anything in some ways relative to the way in which he becomes a forward figure for his country. He had some success in MMA. He's opening up his own gym. It sucks, Jeff, that it got cut short, but he had some great opportunities and memories in MMA.
Yeah, it may suck that it's cut short, but it's a lot better than having something horrible happen to you. And that's the silver lining for me is right there, that he got the diagnosis that he needed to get in order to get out when he got out. What I'll remember about him is that he's kind of a lunch pail kind of guy. He's not flashy or even as exciting in a vacuum as a Conor McGregor, who's got all kinds of great striking. He's just a guy that gets out there and just works hard and gets the job done and gets the crowd excited while he's doing it without all the flashy moves. And then also, he'll sit and have tea with Ariel Helwani, which that's not a bad thing.
He's a lunch pail guy, but he's a quirky guy too, isn't he?
Yeah. Well, one of the great things about covering the fight game is there are these characters in the game. There are these guys who are they come along and you always know who they are, and when they fight, it becomes like, oh, here's old Paddy fighting, that sort of thing. That's always my feeling. Very benevolent sort of fellow who's in the fight game, but also stood up. He's like an Irish guy. So this whole Irish thing, that Dublin card, even though I wasn't there, you could feel it coming out, like how crazy that crowd was. And I just remember him really being at the top of that surging, momentum. Right alongside Conor McGregor, but just basically being a guy who was emblematic of the country, kind of looked the part.
And the time.
And the
Irish MMA was so hot right then.
And I felt like, he was just a prototypical Irish fighter. I felt like, and at a time right when Conor was doing this, it just really stood out. You know what I mean? And he's one of the great guys, great interviews, one of the great characters in our sport.
And you can have a fulfilling life in combat sports without fighting. I know it's hard to hear, but he's got this gym opening up, and he's going to have his own team of fighters, so that'll be cool. No MMA this weekend. I'm so sad about it. But there'll be a UFC Rotterdam the weekend afterwards. So we have a lot to talk about. Ariel will be back next week. Very quickly, what are you doing this weekend? For me, I'm going to drink a wheelbarrow full of Jim Beam. What are you doing?
What are you doing?
I'm going to go to a concert with the man in the shirt.
The Doobie Brothers?
Yeah.
Fish?
The great Dan Byrne.
Dan Byrne.
I don't even know who this is. Who is Dan Byrne?
Look him up.
Look him up, Dan Byrne. Dan Byrne. Headquarters.com, I think.
Yeah.
And don't forget.
Get your shirt.
Right. And MMA Warehouse. You can get the t-shirt again. All proceeds go to Higher Heroes USA, which couldn't be a better cause. So, on that, we'll get out of here.
And there was a guy on Twitter who said if I gave a call out, he would buy 2 shirts. And his name,
he knows who he is.
Darren. Buy your 2 shirts, man.
This is a terrible way to end the show.
Let's go back to Patty for a minute.
Let's just talk about Patty more. All right. Well, he's not here, but for Ariel, for Chuck, for Jeff, I am Luke. Until next time, hands up, chin down, let him fly. This is the MMA Beat.